The envelope in my purse contained enough evidence to destroy my father's life, but I almost didn't use it. 29 years of being the family disappointment had trained me to swallow humiliation, to smile through cruelty, to accept that Victor Whitlow's love was something I'd never earn. Then he stood up at his birthday party and told a room full of people that I was proof not all seeds take root, and something snapped. Not broke, snapped. Like a rubber band pulled too tight, releasing all that stored energy at once. They laughed at his joke. These people who didn't know that their perfect host had built his fortune on stolen children and forged documents. They didn't know that his disappointment daughter had spent months uncovering every twisted detail of his past. But they were about to learn. Because sometimes the child you underestimate is the one who inherited your survival instincts along with your capacity for revenge. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. I hadn't stepped foot in my father's house for nearly 4 years, and standing in the marble foyer now, I remembered exactly why. The place still smelled like expensive cologne and disappointment. Every surface gleamed with that kind of sterile perfection that screams money, but whispers emptiness. My name is Camille Whitlow. I'm 29 years old, and I make my living as a software engineer who pivoted into minimalist entrepreneurship. Clean lines, simple solutions, no unnecessary complications. Everything my family wasn't. The guilt trip that brought me here came courtesy of my sister Brielle, who'd called me 3 weeks ago sobbing about how Dad's 62nd birthday was going to be ruined if I didn't show up. She'd used every manipulation tactic in the book, from fake tears to emotional blackmail about family legacy. I should have hung up. Instead, I bought a plane ticket. The house was already buzzing with guests when I arrived. Men in expensive suits clustered around the bar, their wives draped in jewelry that cost more than most people's cars. These were Dad's people, business associates, country club friends, the kind of crowd that measured success in stock portfolios and vacation homes. I spotted my family immediately. They had that Whitlow bearing, that particular way of holding their chins up like they were posing for invisible cameras. Everett, my eldest brother at 33, stood near the fireplace telling some story that had everyone laughing. He'd always been the golden boy, Harvard Law, successful practice, married to a woman who looked like she stepped out of a magazine. Everything Dad wanted in a son. Everett caught my eye and nodded, his smile never faltering, but I saw the slight tightening around his eyes. He hadn't expected me to actually show up. Brielle was across the room, phone in hand, probably documenting every moment for her Instagram followers. At 27, she'd turned being beautiful into a career. Hundreds of thousands of people followed her lifestyle content, watching her drink expensive coffee and wear clothes she got for free. She was Dad's princess, the daughter who never caused trouble, who always smiled for the cameras. Linus, my younger brother at 25, sat quietly in a corner with a book. He'd always been the mysterious one, the observer. While the rest of us fought for Dad's attention, Linus seemed content to fade into the background. He looked up when I entered, and for just a moment, his serious face broke into something that might have been relief. I dressed carefully for tonight, a simple black dress that said, "I belong here," without trying too hard. But I felt like an imposter anyway. I always had in this house. Growing up, I was the different one. While Everett played sports and brought home straight A's, I painted and wrote poetry. While Brielle mastered the art of being charming, I asked uncomfortable questions. While Linus quietly did what was expected, I challenged everything. Dad never knew what to do with me. I wasn't the son he could show off at the country club, wasn't the daughter he could parade around at charity galas. I was just there, the odd piece that didn't fit the perfect family portrait. Camille. Mom's voice cut through my thoughts. Sylvia Whitlow glided over, her smile bright, but her eyes cautious. At 58, she was still stunning, but I could see the strain around her mouth, the way she held herself too carefully. Mom. I let her hug me, breathing in her familiar perfume. For a moment, I was 8 years old again, running to her after Dad had dismissed another one of my drawings. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered. He's been difficult lately. Before I could ask what she meant, Dad's voice boomed across the room. Well, well. Look who decided to grace us with her presence. Victor Whitlow commanded attention effortlessly. At 62, he was still imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair that made him look distinguished rather than old. His smile was warm for the benefit of his guests, but his eyes, when they met mine, were cold. Hello, Dad. I kept my voice level, neutral. Camille's our little entrepreneur, he announced to the room, and I heard the subtle mockery in his tone. She makes websites or something. The dismissal stung, even though I'd expected it. I'd built a successful consulting business, had clients across 3 continents, but to Dad, if it wasn't law or medicine or something he could brag about at the country club, it didn't matter. I retreated to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. The staff was busy preparing dinner, and I grabbed a glass of water, trying to center myself. My purse sat on the counter, and I could feel the weight of the envelope inside. I'd carried it with me for months, waiting for the right moment. Tonight felt like that moment. Dinner was announced, and we all filed into the dining room. The table was set with Mom's good china, crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier. I found myself seated between Linus and one of Dad's business partners, a man who spent the entire first course talking about his golf game. Dad sat at the head of the table, holding court like always. He told stories about his latest real estate acquisitions, his upcoming retirement plans, his pride in his children's accomplishments. Well, some of his children's accomplishments. Everett just won another big case, he announced, raising his wine glass. And Brielle's follower count just hit 500,000. Can you imagine? 500,000 people wanting to see what my daughter's having for lunch. The table laughed. Brielle blushed prettily and waved her hand dismissively, but I could see how pleased she was. And Linus, Dad continued, is graduating summa cum laude this spring. Physics major, planning to go into research. Linus nodded modestly as the table murmured their congratulations. I felt a familiar twist in my stomach, the old childhood feeling of waiting for my name to be called, knowing it wouldn't be. Camille's doing well too, Mom said quietly. Her business is very successful. Dad's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course it is. The conversation moved on. I picked at my food, hyper-aware of every sound, every glance. This was why I'd stayed away. This feeling of being invisible, of not mattering, of being tolerated rather than welcomed. After dinner, we moved to the living room for dessert and coffee. Dad's friends continued their conversations about stocks and vacations while the family clustered together on the expensive leather furniture. That's when Dad stood up, his wine glass in hand. I'd like to make a toast, he announced, and the room fell quiet. To family, to success, to the next generation carrying on the Whitlow legacy. He looked around the room, his eyes stopping on each of his children in turn. When his gaze reached me, I saw something I couldn't quite identify. Disappointment? Disgust? Something darker? To my incredible children, he continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. To Everett, who makes me proud every day with his success in law. To Brielle, who's turned her natural gifts into an empire. To Linus, who's going to change the world with his brilliant mind. He paused, and I felt my heart start to pound. The room was completely still, everyone hanging on his words. And to Camille, he said finally, his eyes meeting mine across the room. Our family's reminder that not all seeds take root. The silence that followed was deafening. Then someone laughed, nervous, uncomfortable laughter that spread through the room like wildfire. Dad's business partners chuckled and nodded, probably thinking it was some kind of inside family joke. Mom's face went white, her coffee cup rattling against its saucer as she set it down. I felt like I'd been slapped. The humiliation burned through me, hot and sharp and devastating. 29 years old, and my father had just publicly declared me a failure, a disappointment, a mistake. But underneath the hurt, something else was building. Rage. Pure, crystalline rage that cut through the pain like a blade. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room on me. My hands were steady as I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I'd been carrying. I walked across the room, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor, and placed the envelope on Dad's plate. "This is yours, Dad," I said quietly. Then I walked out. I didn't run. I didn't storm off dramatically. I just walked, with dignity, out of that room and out of that house, while behind me the conversation started up again, awkward and forced. Outside, I pulled out my phone and made a call. "It's time," I said when the voice answered. "Take it all." 2 blocks away, a moving truck that had been waiting all evening started its engine. The drive back to my apartment gave me time to think, to let the adrenaline fade and the reality of what I'd just done sink in. I'd been planning this moment for 4 years, ever since the last time Dad had humiliated me in front of the family. But planning something and actually doing it were two different things entirely. My apartment was a study in controlled minimalism, clean lines, neutral colors, everything in its place. It was the opposite of the Whitlow family home, with its excessive decoration and overwhelming presence. Here, I could breathe. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down at my desk, pulling out a box I'd kept hidden in my closet for years. Inside were journals, old letters, and documents I'd inherited from my grandmother Beatrix when she passed away 3 years ago. Beatrix had been the only member of the family who truly understood me, who saw something in me that the others missed. The first journal I opened was from my teenage years, and I found myself reading an entry from when I was 16. Dad called me a waste of potential, again today. I told him I didn't want to apply to law school like Everett, that I wanted to study art or maybe computer science. He said I was throwing my life away, that I'd never amount to anything if I didn't follow a practical path. Mom just sat there, like always. Sometimes I wonder if he'd be happier if I just disappeared. I remembered that fight vividly. It was the first time I'd really stood up to him, and the first time I'd seen that look in his eyes, not just disappointment, but something closer to hatred. Like I was a personal affront to everything he'd built. But it was an older memory that haunted me more. I was 8 years old, sitting in the kitchen with Mom while she made dinner. I'd been talking about how different I felt from the rest of the family, how sometimes I didn't feel like I belonged. Mom had gotten very quiet, very still. Then she'd said something that stuck with me for years. "You remind your father of someone from his past. Someone he'd rather forget." I'd asked what she meant, but she'd clammed up, changing the subject with that nervous laugh she used when she'd said too much. I set the journal aside and picked up a letter I'd never opened, one of several that had been sealed when Beatrix died. Her handwriting was shaky but determined. "My dearest Camille, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're old enough to handle the truth. Your father has done terrible things, things that would destroy the family if they came to light. But you have a right to know who you really are. What Victor did in 1987 changes everything. Don't trust the house, darling. Don't trust the stories they've told you about your birth. And whatever you do, find the truth about your sister. Your sister. Yes, you have a sister. Victor made sure she disappeared, just like he tried to make you disappear in your own family. The documents you need are in the wall safe behind my portrait in the study. The combination is your real birth date, not the one on your legal documents. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this while I was alive. I was a coward. But you, my dear, are braver than all of us. With love and regret, Beatrix." My hands were shaking as I set the letter down. A sister? A real birth date different from what I'd always known? The implications were staggering. Meanwhile, back at the family home, I could only imagine the chaos I'd left behind. Victor would have opened the envelope by now. Inside, he would have found a revocation notice, legal documents that stripped him of ownership of the house and his collection of vintage cars. Properties and assets that I'd quietly transferred to him over the years as gestures of attempted reconciliation, always hoping that maybe this time he'd see me as worthy of his love. But I'd kept the power to take them back. And tonight I had. I could picture his rage, the way his face would turn red, the sound of crystal breaking as he threw his wine glass. Mom would try to calm him, Everett would demand explanations, and Brielle would probably cry. But Linus would be thinking. He'd always been the observer, the one who noticed things the rest of us missed. And he'd been quiet tonight, even quieter than usual. The next morning, I drove to the address Beatrix had written in her letter, a modest house in an older part of town where her friend Nadine still lived. Nadine was in her 80s now, but her eyes were sharp as she invited me in for tea. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, settling into her chair with a sigh. "Beatrix said you would, eventually. She left me a letter," I said. "About my father, about what happened in 1987. Nadine nodded slowly. "That was a dark time for Victor. He was young then, maybe 24, 25. Already married to your mother, but not happy about it. Sylvia was pregnant, but she lost the baby." I felt my stomach drop. "She miscarried?" "5 months along. A little girl." Sylvia was devastated. Took to her bed for weeks. Victor was different then. Desperate to give her something to fill that hole. "Different how?" Nadine's eyes grew distant. "He was involved with some questionable people back then. Business associates who didn't ask too many questions about where things came from. There was a clinic run by a doctor who, let's say, he was flexible about paperwork." "What kind of clinic?" "The kind that helped people who couldn't have children of their own. And the kind that helped people who had children they didn't want to keep." The implication hit me like a physical blow. "You're saying I was bought?" "Not bought," Nadine said gently. "Arranged. Victor brought you home when you were barely 3 days old. Told Sylvia you were a miracle, a gift. She was so grateful, so desperate to be a mother, that she never asked the right questions." "And my biological mother?" "A young woman who got herself in trouble. Victor made her problems go away, and she made his go away. It was supposed to be a clean transaction. But something went wrong." Nadine nodded. "Your father once erased a child from his life before you ever came along. And he tried to erase you too, in his own way." I left Nadine's house with more questions than answers, but one thing was becoming clear. Everything I'd believed about my life, about my family, about who I was, had been built on lies. The photo was tucked away in an old jewelry box that had belonged to Beatrix, hidden behind a false bottom I'd discovered while going through her things. It was faded and yellowed with age, showing a baby wrapped in a pink blanket. On the back, in Beatrix's careful handwriting, "C. 1993. 2 years before I was born." I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to process what it meant. Another baby. Another C. Another daughter that Victor had somehow been involved with. My hands were shaking as I called Mom. "Camille?" Sylvia's voice was strained, exhausted. "Honey, your father he's very upset about last night." "I need to talk to you," I said. "Not about Dad."
"About me."
"About my birth." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought she'd hung up. "I can't," she whispered finally. "Mom, I found Beatrix's letter. I know about the miscarriage. I know about the clinic." I heard her sharp intake of breath, then what sounded like sobbing. "Please," I said gently. "I need to understand who I am." An hour later, Mom sat in my living room, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. She clutched a tissue in her hands, her wedding ring catching the light as she twisted her fingers nervously. "I lost her at 22 weeks, she said quietly. "We were going to name her Catherine. I held her, you know. She was so tiny, but she was perfect." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. The pain in her voice was raw, even after all these years. "Your father was different back then. Gentler, I thought. When he brought you home, he said you were meant to be ours. That God had taken Catherine so that we could have you instead. But you suspected something was wrong." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You looked nothing like either of us. Dark hair when we're all blonde, green eyes when ours are blue. But I wanted to believe so badly that you were meant to be mine." "What made you start questioning it?" "You were about 5 when I overheard Victor talking to someone on the phone. He was angry, worried about loose ends and keeping stories straight. When I asked him about it, he got furious. Said I was being paranoid, that I should be grateful for what we had." I reached across and took her hand. "Mom, I took a DNA test." Her face went white. "You're not my biological mother," I said gently. "But you're still my mom. You raised me, you loved me, You tried to protect me. I failed you, she whispered. I let him treat you the way he did. I knew something was wrong, but I was too scared to dig deeper. Too scared of losing you. You didn't fail me. You did the best you could in an impossible situation. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the weight of 30 years of lies. There's something else, I said finally. Beatrix mentioned a sister. Mom looked confused. What sister? I think there was another baby. Before me. Someone Dad was involved with, someone who disappeared. Before Mom could respond, my phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. Hello. Is this Camille Whitlow? The voice was female, uncertain. Yes, who is this? My name is Marley Davis. I got your number from a genealogy website. I think we might be sisters. My heart stopped. What? I've been searching for my biological family for years. Your name came up as a DNA match, and when I saw your photo on your business website, we look alike. A lot alike. She was right. When we met at a coffee shop the next day, it was like looking at a slightly older version of myself. Same dark hair, same green eyes, same stubborn chin. Marley was 31, a journalist who'd spent her life bouncing between foster homes before aging out of the system at 18. I was born in 1993, she said, stirring her coffee nervously. No record of my biological parents, no information about why I was given up. Just a note that said the adoption was privately arranged. That was the year on the photo, I said, showing her the picture from Beatrix's jewelry box. Her eyes widened. That's me. I'm sure of it. I have the same blanket in my foster records. So, you're the first daughter. The one Dad erased. Marley's jaw tightened. And you're the replacement he bought to make his wife happy. We spent hours comparing notes, building a timeline of Victor's actions in the early 90s. Marley had done extensive research into the clinic that had handled her adoption, only to discover it had been shut down in 1995 amid allegations of illegal practices. Your father was one of the investors, she said, sliding a folder across the table. I've been tracking his involvement for months. Inside were documents that painted a picture of Victor's younger self, ambitious, ruthless, willing to cut corners to get what he wanted. The clinic had been a side investment, something that had made him money, while also solving his personal problems. He must have panicked when you showed up on genealogy sites, I said. Or he would have if he'd known. But I've been careful. Using my adoptive name, not mentioning the Whitlow connection. Until now. Until now, she agreed. Meanwhile, back at the family home, my brothers were having their own revelations. Linus had apparently decided to break his usual silence and confront Everett about the family's reaction to my dramatic exit. According to a text from Linus later that evening, Everett had been furious, not at Dad for his cruel toast, but at me for embarrassing the family in front of his business associates. He'd started making calls to his contacts in real estate and finance, trying to figure out how I'd managed to pull off the legal maneuver with the house and cars. But Linus had dropped a bombshell of his own. He'd found documents years ago, papers hidden in Dad's study that mentioned my adoption. He'd been too young to understand what they meant at the time, and too scared to bring them up as he got older. I should have told you, he texted. I was a coward. You were protecting yourself, I replied. I understand. But I was done being understanding. I was done being the family's dirty secret, the reminder of Victor's shameful past. If he wanted to erase me, he was going to learn that some things can't be undone. Marley and I spent the next week gathering evidence. She had contacts in journalism, people who knew how to dig into public records and find the stories that powerful people tried to bury. I had technical skills and resources that could help us piece together the digital trail of Victor's past activities. What we found was worse than either of us had imagined. The clinic hadn't just been about illegal adoptions. It had been part of a larger network that trafficked babies across state lines, falsified birth certificates, and destroyed records to cover their tracks. Victor had been more than just an investor. He'd been actively involved in operations. And we weren't his only victims. There were at least a dozen other children whose origins could be traced back to the clinic, all of them placed with families who'd paid for the privilege of no questions asked. He's built his entire life on erasing people, Marley said as we sat in my apartment, surrounded by documents and photos. First me, then you in a different way, probably others we don't even know about. Not anymore, I said, reaching for my laptop. It's time to stop being erased. The plan we came up with was simple, but devastating. Victor was scheduled to host his annual charity gala in 2 weeks, a high-profile event that would be attended by local politicians, business leaders, and media figures. The perfect audience for the kind of revelation that would destroy not just his reputation, but his legacy. Are you sure about this? Marley asked as we finalized our preparations. Once we do this, there's no going back. Your family will never forgive you. I thought about Dad's toast, about 30 years of being made to feel like I didn't belong, about all the other children who'd been erased or displaced to serve his ambitions. Good, I said. I'm done asking for their forgiveness. 2 weeks had passed since Marley and I began our investigation, and we'd assembled enough evidence to destroy Victor's carefully constructed life. Our plan was elegant in its simplicity: use his own charity gala against him, turn his moment of public glory into his downfall. The Whitlow Foundation's annual gala was Victor's crown jewel, the event where he played philanthropist for the cameras while rubbing shoulders with the city's elite. This year's theme was Building Stronger Families, which felt like cosmic justice given what we were about to reveal. Marley had used her journalism credentials to get us press passes. She'd convinced her editor that there might be a story worth covering, and we'd spent days rehearsing our approach. The plan was surgical. Wait for the perfect moment, then detonate everything we discovered in the most public way possible. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror that evening, applying lipstick with steady hands. My reflection looked back at me, calm, determined, ready. I was wearing a navy dress that commanded respect without being flashy, my dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun. I looked like someone you'd take seriously, someone whose words carried weight. The grand ballroom at the Riverside Hotel was transformed into Victor's vision of elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in white linen, each centerpiece a carefully arranged bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. The irony of the baby's breath wasn't lost on me. I watched from across the room as my family worked the crowd. Everett moved between groups of lawyers and judges, his wife Rachel at his side playing the perfect political spouse. Brielle posed for photos with local influencers, her smile bright and practiced. Even Linus was there, looking uncomfortable in his formal suit but dutifully representing the family. Victor stood at the center of it all, resplendent in his custom tuxedo, accepting congratulations and praise from everyone who approached him. This was his element: being admired, being celebrated, being seen as the pillar of the community he'd worked so hard to become. Sylvia stood beside him, elegant in emerald green, but I could see the strain around her eyes. She'd been different since our conversation, quieter, more withdrawn. The weight of carrying 30 years of lies was finally showing. You ready for this? Marley whispered beside me. She dyed her hair blonde for the evening and wore glasses, a simple disguise that made her look like any other reporter covering the event. I've been ready for 4 years, I replied. The evening followed its predictable pattern. Cocktails, dinner, speeches about the importance of charitable giving and community support. Victor's opening remarks were masterful, full of humble gratitude and inspiring vision. He talked about building stronger families, about giving every child the chance to thrive, about the foundation's work supporting adoption services. I nearly choked on my wine at that last part. And now, Victor announced, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom, I'd like to share a special presentation about the families we've helped this year. The lights dimmed, and a screen descended from the ceiling. This was our moment. Marley slipped away from our table and made her way to the media booth, where the audiovisual team was managing the presentation. I'd hacked into their system earlier, uploading our own files and setting them to override the planned slideshow. The first slide appeared, a photo of the Riverside Adoption Clinic, circa 1993. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people tried to understand what they were seeing. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, standing and projecting my voice across the room, allow me to introduce you to the real Victor Whitlow. The next slide showed financial records linking Victor to the clinic's operations. Then came testimonials from former staff members, documents detailing illegal adoptions, records of falsified birth certificates. Victor's face went white, then red, then a mottled purple that made me worry he might have a stroke right there on stage. "What is this?" he demanded, but his voice was drowned out by the gasps and shocked murmurs from the audience. The final slide was a birth certificate, mine, showing the false information that had been used to create my legal identity. Beside it was a photo of Marley as a baby, with documents showing how she'd been taken from her biological mother and placed into the foster system when the family who'd paid for her couldn't complete the transaction. "My name is Camille Whitlow," I announced to the stunned crowd, "and I am one of Victor Whitlow's victims. The daughter he bought to replace the child my mother lost." The reminder that not all seeds take root. Chaos erupted. Reporters surged forward with cameras and microphones. Victor's business associates began backing away from him as if his crimes were contagious. Sylvia collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands. But the coup de grace was still coming. "And if that's not enough," Marley said, stepping forward and removing her glasses, "I have audio evidence of Mr. Whitlow attempting to bribe a former clinic employee just last month." She pressed play on a small device, and Victor's voice filled the ballroom through the sound system. "Whatever it takes to keep this quiet. I don't care what it costs. My reputation, my family's future, it all depends on this staying buried." The recording had been obtained through a former nurse who'd contacted Marley after seeing her initial inquiries about the clinic. The woman had been carrying guilt for decades about her involvement, and when Victor had approached her with money to stay quiet, she'd had the presence of mind to record the conversation. Victor tried to speak, to explain, to spin the narrative, but the damage was done. Security guards were already moving toward him, and I could see flashing lights outside the windows. Someone had called the police. Everett's face was a mask of horror and calculation. I could see him trying to figure out how to distance himself from the family scandal, how to protect his own career from the fallout. He caught my eye across the room, and for a moment his mask slipped. "Camille," he called out, pushing through the crowd toward me. "Maybe we could talk about this. Rebuild the family, you know? Start fresh." The desperate note in his voice was almost funny. This was the same brother who'd spent our entire childhood looking down on me, who'd stood by while Victor humiliated me, who'd been angry at me just weeks ago for embarrassing the family. Now that he saw which way the wind was blowing, suddenly he wanted to be on my side. "The time for rebuilding was 30 years ago," I said, "when I needed a family who would love me instead of tolerate me." Brielle had gone completely pale, swaying on her feet as the reality of what this meant for her carefully curated public image sank in. Her phone was buzzing constantly, probably notifications from her social media accounts as the story spread online. "This will ruin everything," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My career, my reputation." "Your reputation was built on a lie anyway," I said, not unkindly. "Maybe now you can figure out who you really are when you're not performing for cameras." But it was Linus who surprised me the most. While the rest of the family fell apart around us, he walked calmly across the ballroom and stood beside me. "I should have done this years ago," he said quietly. "I should have stood up for you. You were just a kid, Linus. This wasn't your fight. It is now." The police arrived and began questioning Victor, but his lawyer appeared seemingly out of nowhere, advising him to say nothing. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one last time. "You always were the most dangerous Whitlow," he said, and despite everything, there was something almost like pride in his voice. The weeks following the gala were a whirlwind of media attention, legal proceedings, and family fallout. The story had everything journalists loved: wealth, scandal, family secrets, and babies stolen from their mothers. It went national within days, then international as similar stories began emerging from other cities where the clinic had operated. I found myself at the center of a media storm I hadn't entirely prepared for. Reporters camped outside my apartment building, wanting interviews about my experience growing up as Victor's bought daughter. I gave a few carefully chosen interviews, always making sure to highlight the broader issue of illegal adoption practices rather than just my personal story. But the most important work was happening behind the scenes. Marley had quit her regular job to focus full-time on investigative reporting about the clinic's network. Her initial story had won her a spot at a major newspaper, and she was using that platform to help other victims find their biological families. "We've identified 17 other children so far," she told me over coffee one morning, spreading photos across the table between us. All of them placed through the clinic between 1985 and 1995. I studied the faces, babies who'd grown into adults, all of them carrying the same questions about their origins that had haunted me my entire life. "Have you been able to reunite any of them?" "3 so far. 2 others have found their biological mothers, but the mothers don't want contact. The trauma runs deep on both sides." I understood that. The biological mothers had been young, desperate, often coerced into giving up their children. Not all of them were ready to face the past, even if it meant reconnecting with the children they'd lost. My own biological mother remained a mystery. The records from the clinic had been deliberately destroyed, and the few surviving staff members either couldn't or wouldn't identify her. But Sylvia had given me a name, Renata, and a story that broke my heart. She was about 19, Mom had told me during one of our long conversations. "Your father said she was from out of state, that she couldn't take care of a baby. He made it sound like we were doing her a favor. Do you think she wanted to give me up?" "I don't know, honey." I was so desperate to believe the story that I never asked the hard questions. The relationship with Sylvia had become complicated in ways I was still trying to navigate. She wasn't my biological mother, but she'd raised me, loved me in her limited way, tried to protect me from Victor's worst impulses. The revelation of my adoption had freed her in some ways. She'd finally filed for divorce and was living in a small apartment across town, rebuilding her life at 58. Brielle had spiraled in the aftermath of the gala. Her social media empire had crumbled almost overnight as sponsors pulled their support and followers abandoned her accounts. She disappeared from public view entirely, reportedly checking into a treatment facility for anxiety and depression. I felt bad for her in a way I hadn't expected. Yes, she'd been part of the family dynamic that had made my childhood miserable, but she'd also been a victim of Victor's need to control and manipulate. She'd spent her entire life performing for his approval, never knowing that the whole foundation was built on lies. Everett had fared better, at least professionally. His law firm had distanced itself from the family scandal, and he'd managed to keep most of his clients by positioning himself as another victim of Victor's deception. But our relationship was beyond repair. He'd shown his true colors during the crisis, caring more about protecting his reputation than seeking justice or supporting family members who'd been hurt. It was Linus who surprised me the most. In the weeks following the gala, he'd become a regular presence in my life, stopping by my apartment to check on me, helping me deal with the media attention, even assisting Marley with her research. "I need to understand what I was part of," he'd told me. What we all were part of. He'd moved out of the family home and was staying in my guest room while he figured out his next steps. Victor's arrest had disrupted his college funding, but Linus had discovered a fierce independence I'd never seen in him before. "I don't want his money anyway," he said one evening as we ate takeout Chinese food on my couch. "I'd rather work my way through school than owe him anything." "What about your physics research?" "I'll find another way. Maybe this whole experience will give me a different perspective on what I want to study. Psychology, maybe. Or social work." The criminal case against Victor was moving slowly, but steadily forward. The district attorney had charged him with fraud, conspiracy, and violation of adoption laws. His lawyer was arguing for a plea deal, but the evidence was overwhelming and public pressure was intense. I'd been asked to testify, but I declined. The prosecutors understood my position. I'd already said everything that needed to be said at the gala, and forcing me to relive the trauma in court wouldn't add much to their case. Instead, I was focusing on something more constructive. Using the inheritance from Beatrix, which had turned out to be worth considerably more than anyone had realized, I was starting a foundation to help other victims of illegal adoption practices. The artwork alone was valued at over $3 million, and I planned to auction most of it to fund the organization. "Are you sure about this?" Marley asked when I told her about my plans. "That money could set you up for life." "I don't need to be set up for life," I said. "I need to feel like my life has meaning." The foundation would provide legal assistance to adoptees searching for their biological families, support for birth parents who'd been coerced into giving up their children, and advocacy for stronger adoption regulations. We'd also fund DNA testing and genealogy research for victims of illegal adoption schemes. But perhaps the most important work was emotional. I'd started attending therapy regularly, finally dealing with 30 years of feeling unwanted and out of place. Dr. Sarah Chun was helping me understand that my worth wasn't determined by Victor's opinion of me, that I could build my own identity separate from the family that had never truly accepted me. "You spent your whole life trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it," she told me during one session. "Now you get to learn what it feels like to love and accept yourself." It was harder than it sounded. 30 years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. But slowly, I was beginning to understand that the problem had never been with me. The problem had been with a family system built on lies, manipulation, and the desperate need to maintain a perfect facade. The real breakthrough came when I gave my first public speech about the experience. It was at a conference for adoptees and birth parents, and I was terrified. But standing at that podium, looking out at faces that reflected my own struggles, I felt something I'd never felt before: belonging. "You are not broken," I told the audience. "You are not a mistake. Sometimes the family we find is stronger than the one we're born into or forced into. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is permission to stop trying to fix relationships that were never healthy to begin with." The standing ovation that followed was overwhelming. Afterward, dozens of people approached me with their own stories, their own struggles with identity and belonging. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and I found myself thinking about endings. Not the dramatic, explosive kind that make for good television, but the quiet, gradual kind that happen in real life when the dust settles and you're left to figure out what comes next. Victor's trial had concluded 3 weeks ago. He'd been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy, with additional state charges pending in 3 other jurisdictions where the clinic had operated. The judge had been particularly harsh, noting that his crimes had affected the most vulnerable members of society, children and desperate mothers. I hadn't attended the sentencing, but Marley had been there as a reporter. She told me that Victor had looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of his exposed secrets. He'd made no statement, offered no apology, just accepted his fate with the same cold calculation he'd brought to everything else in his life. But it was the letter he'd sent me from prison that really stayed with me. It had arrived 2 days after his sentencing, written in his familiar, precise handwriting on institutional stationery. "Camille, I won't insult your intelligence by pretending I'm sorry. We both know I'm not sorry for what I did. I'm sorry I got caught. You outplayed me, and I respect that more than you might expect. You always were the most dangerous Whitlow. I saw it in you from the beginning, that stubborn refusal to accept what you were told, that need to dig deeper and ask uncomfortable questions. It's why I could never love you the way you wanted me to. You were too much like me. I hope you used that dangerous streak better than I did. Victor." I'd read that letter a dozen times, trying to understand what he meant. Too much like him? I was nothing like him. I'd spent my whole life trying to be the opposite of him. But then I'd realized he was talking about the relentless pursuit of truth, the refusal to accept convenient lies, the willingness to burn everything down if that's what it took to expose what was hidden underneath. Those were the qualities that had brought down his carefully constructed world, and in his twisted way, he was acknowledging that I'd inherited them from him. Not biologically, I knew now that we shared no DNA. But culturally, environmentally, shaped by growing up in his house and watching his methods, even as I rejected his values. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to erase me from his perfect family, he'd created the very person who would ultimately expose all his secrets. Marley had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative series on illegal adoption networks. She'd used the platform to advocate for legislative changes, working with lawmakers to close loopholes that had allowed operations like the clinic to flourish. Her work had already led to reforms in 6 states, with more legislation pending. "None of this would have happened without you," she told me at the awards ceremony. "You lit the fuse that brought it all down." "We lit it together," I replied. "And we're going to keep fighting together." The foundation was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. We'd helped reunite 43 families so far, provided legal assistance to dozens of adoptees searching for their origins, and funded research into better support systems for all members of the adoption triangle. The work was hard, often heartbreaking, but deeply meaningful. Linus had become my unofficial business partner, using his analytical mind to help organize our data and research. He'd switched his major to social work and was volunteering at the foundation while finishing his degree. The quiet, mysterious brother I'd grown up with had evolved into a passionate advocate for children's rights. "I think this is what I was meant to do," he told me one evening as we worked late in the foundation's office. "All those years of watching and not speaking up, maybe it was preparation for this." Sylvia had found her own path to healing. She'd started a support group for mothers who'd experienced pregnancy loss, using her story to help others process their grief. The divorce had been finalized, and she was dating a kind man who owned a bookstore and treated her with the gentle respect she'd never received from Victor. "I should have protected you better," she told me during one of our monthly lunches. "I should have asked harder questions, demanded real answers." "You did the best you could with what you knew," I said. "And you gave me the only real maternal love I ever had. That still matters." Brielle had emerged from treatment 6 months later, looking fragile but genuine in a way I'd never seen before. She'd started a blog about recovering from perfectionism and people-pleasing, sharing her story with a vulnerability that was the opposite of her old curated content. "I spent my whole life performing for an audience," she'd written in one post. "Now I'm learning what it feels like to just be myself, even when myself is messy and imperfect and not particularly photogenic." She'd reached out to me tentatively, asking if we could talk. The conversation had been awkward and painful, full of apologies and explanations that couldn't undo 30 years of family dysfunction. But it was a start. Everett remained distant, focused on rebuilding his career and protecting what remained of his reputation. We'd exchanged a few civil emails about legal matters related to the estate, but there was no warmth there, no desire for reconciliation. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. I'd finally found my biological mother's grave in a small town 3 hours away. Renata Sullivan had died in a car accident when she was 26, just 6 years after I was born. She'd never married, never had other children, never got the chance to wonder what had happened to the baby she'd been forced to give up. I'd stood at her gravestone on a cold February morning, holding flowers and trying to imagine the young woman who'd carried me for 9 months, who'd given birth to me, who'd had to watch as strangers took me away. "I made it," I'd whispered to the marble headstone. "I survived, and I'm helping other people survive too. I hope that would have made you proud." The most surprising development had been my growing relationship with some of the other victims of the clinic's operations. We'd formed an informal support network, sharing stories and resources, celebrating each other's victories in rebuilding our lives. One of them, a man named David who'd been adopted by a family in Oregon, had become particularly close. He understood the unique challenges of growing up feeling like you didn't belong, of carrying questions about your identity that couldn't be answered with simple explanations. "We're the lucky ones," he told me over dinner last week. "We figured out the truth. We found each other. We turned our pain into purpose." He was right. For all the trauma and upheaval, I felt more grounded now than I ever had growing up in the Whitlow house. I knew who I was. Not Victor's unwanted daughter or Sylvia's replacement child, but Camille, a woman who'd survived and thrived and built something meaningful from the wreckage of her origins. The foundation had received a significant donation from an unexpected source. Beatrix's art collection had sold for even more than estimated, and a wealthy collector had been so moved by our story that he'd matched the entire proceeds. We now had enough funding to expand nationally to help victims of illegal adoption practices across the country. I'd started writing a memoir about the experience, working with an editor who specialized in family trauma narratives. The book would be called The Mistake That Wasn't, and all proceeds would go to the foundation. But the real victory wasn't in the money or the media attention, or even the criminal conviction. It was in the quiet moments of peace I'd found, the ability to wake up in the morning without the weight of trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. I'd returned to the family estate one last time, after the bank had foreclosed and before the new owners took possession. The house stood empty, stripped of its expensive furniture and artwork, all the trappings of wealth that had once seemed so important to Victor. I'd walked through the rooms where I'd spent my childhood feeling like an outsider, remembering all the times I'd tried so hard to fit in, to be worthy of love and acceptance. Now the house felt smaller somehow, less imposing, just an empty shell that had once contained too many lies. In the dining room where Victor had delivered his cruel toast, I'd placed a single item on the mantel, the original envelope I'd given him that night, the one that had started everything. Let the new owners wonder about its significance. Let it be a reminder that some secrets have consequences that echo through time. Standing in the doorway, looking back at the place that had shaped so much of my pain, I felt something I'd never expected: gratitude. Not for the pain itself, but for what it had taught me about resilience, about the power of truth, about the importance of chosen family over biological obligation. Victor had been right about one thing: I was dangerous. Dangerous to people who built their lives on lies, who gained power by erasing others, who thought they could control and manipulate without consequences. But I was also something he'd never understood. I was free. Free from the need for his approval. Free from the weight of family expectations that had never fit. Free to build a life based on my own values rather than someone else's vision of who I should be. He'd never spoken to me again after that night at the gala. Not during the investigation, not during the trial, not even in his letter. But in that silence, I'd heard everything I needed to know. I'd heard acknowledgement. I'd heard defeat. I'd heard the sound of a man who'd finally met someone he couldn't erase, couldn't diminish, couldn't make disappear. And in that silence, I'd found my voice. What would you do if you discovered that the people who raised you had built their love on a foundation of lies, and that you had the power to expose it all? If Camille's journey of uncovering family secrets and finding her true identity resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the courage it takes to rewrite your own ending.